Hey there, hunters. Welcome back to the Gunners Guild. It's definitely been a while for sure. So today we're going to talk about and sort of review Monster Hunter Wilds. There's a lot to talk about, so I'll try to make this quick, but I am limited in what footage I can show. So this is mostly just going to be B-roll footage of early hunts, and I'll fit some appropriate clips where I can. But anyway, at the time of writing this review, I am currently HR 100, and I've pretty much done everything in the game, all optional quests, all side quests, crafted pretty much all the gear I wanted, and did a lot of farming. So just as a reference, I put my time in. So I'm going to discuss certain topics and talk about the pros and cons of each of them that I found, and you can kind of make your own decision about Wild. I'm just going to tell you about all the little systems and what I liked and disliked about it. So let's get into this. First, I'm going to talk about the performance and the graphics. Now, thankfully, Monster Hunter Wilds performs much better than the beta did on both my laptop, which is running an i7 11th gen CPU and a mobile 4060 card, and my desktop, which is a 12th gen i9 and a 4070 Ti. After the beta, I was not really impressed with how the game was running, and I was genuinely concerned with the launch of Wilds, seeing as how Dragon's Dogma 2 was on the same engine and just launched in an abysmal state. So I'm glad to say that Wilds is actually running pretty good. Not perfect, but good. On my laptop, I do have to have frame gen running, but I'm still pushing around 70 to 90 frames, which looks solid. But there are some noticeable input drops, and I do still have some hiccups here and there depending on the weather. And every now and then I'll get some graphical glitches and tearing. So it's not perfect, but in my 50-60 hours of playing, it doesn't happen all that often. On my desktop, I'm not running frame gen, and I can still hit that 70-80 frame mark, which is great. But obviously it should be better given my specs, but I'm not mad at the performance either. I'm just not really impressed with it. It runs well enough that I'm not going to complain about it, but I'm also just not going to lie to you and say that it's amazing and flawless, because it's clearly not. And while playing on my desktop, I did still have a few crashes and graphical errors, but mostly, in this, 50-60 hours that I've put in so far, it's happened maybe 4 times, 5 times max, so it's really not all that often. Again, not going to complain that much, because it doesn't really impact you a whole lot. There's autosaves everywhere, but it is there. Now visually, I think the game is actually very impressive. There's a lot of clutter and foliage in the little details on all the maps, and it's genuinely beautiful to look at, especially the monsters. They're absolute peak. I just think the beta and the first zone being the desert was kind of a bad call, because I don't think it's very visually pleasing to most people. When the monsters get covered in sand, which is basically all the time, they tend to look like clay. So the beta impressions were not good when you combine the poor performance and the drab color palette of the desert. But here in the full game, overall, it gets a pass from me on the presentation. Again, kind of nervous about the game's visual presentation because beta wasn't really giving me hope, and I didn't like Rise, which is on the same engine. So I was concerned what it was going to look like in the end, but ultimately, once you get past the desert, Wilds genuinely stands up great, looks amazing, and I actually do love it. Now with all the visual and performance out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the story. So I am glad that Capcom is going out of the way to try and make Monster Hunter more story-driven with, memorable characters, voice acting, and trying to connect the lore of the regions together and the history. That's great, good for an expanding IP, rooting for them in that regard. That being said, it's Monster Hunter, and even in Wilds, the story is not good at all in my opinion. There are not really any dramatic events, no plot twists, nothing that you don't already know is coming. The game is Monster Hunter, the story is hunt monsters. This was pretty disappointing because Capcom tried to hype up the story elements of the game, like the Nata kid who's supposed to be super important and he doesn't do anything at all ever. And almost everywhere you go, it's the exact same scenario, and it kind of got old quick. You walk into an area, you get escorted through town, you talk to town folk, rescue the town from a monster, move on to the next area, get escorted through the town, talk to the town folk, kill the monster. And I went through all the dialogue, I listened to it all, I watched all the cutscenes, and overall, it really didn't add much to the game for me. I wish it had, and again, it's good that Capcom is trying to expand that part of Monster Hunter since they've kind of already nailed the whole combat portion, but they really need some better writers or something if they're going to try to make the story a big part of the game. Overall, not impressed with the story personally. Moving on to the core gameplay, like the actual hunting and questing, to me, the rest of this is like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing, like the entire time. I actually like the changes they made to the core combat flow and like with the wounding system. Originally, I thought I'm not going to enjoy it, but it's really not intrusive, nor does it break down the combat flow at all. So for this game's gimmick, it's definitely a better mechanic than like Silk Bugs, Wyvern Riding, and Clutch Claw. Wounds give the player a reason to not strictly target a monster's head all the time, because wounds can provide useful stagger opportunities for big damage on like a dunk or a topple, and they can be set up pretty much on demand. Once you get into the flow of using wounds at specific times and breaking parts for topples, it it becomes a very interactive system that can aid in your clears rather than just be like a temporary damage boost kind of thing. And I'm also glad we have the Slinger back from World to shoot pods and stuff with, no claw attached. Throwing flash bombs and slinger pods and dung pods have always had useful applications, and we've seen some pretty interesting uses for these in like the speedruns and such. Now, a big plus for Wilds also is that every monster on the roster is a pretty good fight. There wasn't any monster that I felt had like really bad hitboxes or questionable AoE spam and all that nonsense. So honestly, I'm not going to complain about any of the fights, like nothing here from me. In that regard at least. But the actual monster roster is fairly small. I believe this is probably one of the smallest launch rosters a Monster Hunter game has had since like Try. So of course we're going to have regular title updates that are going to expand on the roster as well, as we've already seen with Mizutsun. So all I'm really saying is that people might just get a little bored with the starting roster, but this should be remedied rather quick. But anyway, all the fights are good and I had lots of fun with all of them. So even doing the endgame grind stuff, not painful. There's nothing bad I can really say about the minute-to-minute combat of the game, which is great because that's Monster Hunter's bread and butter. So what do I mean when I say it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back? Basically because every other system in the game is kind of annoying to engage with. So let's get into that. First is going to be the Canteen. Monster Hunter is all about the food, and Wilds is really all about the food. Like, they went all out on the cutscenes and cooking. It's like another one of those great visual touches. I love it. But the Canteen is not fun to deal with. The way the Canteen works in Wilds is that you can make a simple 3-ingredient meal from your camp, which offers you your 50 health, your 100 stamina, and then some minor effects for 50 minutes. These ingredients that you use, you have to farm for individually. You just don't unlock foods like in older games that you just can use whenever you want. And there's no way to like farm or generate these cooking materials in large amounts like some other village systems that we used to have in previous games. So you have to be constantly like going out there and collecting materials for these foods that you actually want to eat to get specific meal skills and stats for your food. There's also not that many ingredients and food skills to eat for. It's just a small handful of effects. So there's nothing really like crazy powerful like in previous games. Like overall, the food system is pretty toned down, I'd say. So the food skills in Wilds though do actually last for 50 minutes of in-game hunting, which is an improvement over the one single hunt like the other games. But unfortunately, there's no easy way to track how much time you have left on your food without actually going back to your camp and begin cooking another meal. And this is important because this timer can fall off in the middle of your hunt, so your 50 HP and 100 stamina bonus can just drop off and put you in a pretty dangerous position. You have to constantly be checking on your food time and eat meals before that timer's up so it doesn't fall off in the middle of a hunt. And honestly, that gets kind of annoying. I feel like the timer should just get locked at like 1 second if you're in the middle of a hunt and then just fall off once you're done. I think that would be a great improvement. Now, there are bigger meals that are offered by the villages, which have better stats and skills, and these are obviously the ones that you really want. But these are only rarely offered, and it's not something you can guarantee to get. It kind of moves and rotates around in actual in-game time. You just kind of have to wait for a specific amount of time to pass before someone will offer to cook you a better meal. And again, this gets old when food skills and stats are very important in this game, so having to wait and having no way to just generate a better meal kind of sucks. Second thing I wanted to talk about was the maps and the pop-up camps. While visually gorgeous, the maps are actually very convoluted in how they're laid out, at least in my opinion. There's a lot of transitional areas and runways that are impossible to see, and some of these areas can only be navigated via Secrate, and some only on foot. So you have to constantly be looking at your mini-maps to check areas to move to and you'll find the dots, or just let your Secrate auto-run you to the targeted monster location. And the maps are also very one-tone, and I know this is going to be kind of hard to explain, but like the desert is all the same color palette. It's all just browns and grays. The forest is all just solid greens and plants. I mean, duh. But there's like no visual difference in some areas, like there's not a rotten part of the forest or a mushroom part or something that acts like a landmark to take note of to help you get oriented. Maybe that's just a me issue in my navigation, but the areas just look all very similar, and so it's really hard to get familiar with the zones and the maps. And between that and basically having mandatory guiding by the Secrate, I feel like I'm just never going to fully learn these maps just because the layouts are so weird. This is a rather minor point, but it does force you to look at the minimap all the time. It's just one of those things where it just gets on my nerves a little more and more. The pop-up camps are also another small annoyance. Discovering camps and placing camps down isn't new in Monster Hunter. We've had it in World and Rise. And here in Wilds, we can do the same thing, but we do have more camp locations and options on each map, which is cool. But they can't just be placed anywhere. They are all still fixed locations. But these locations are mostly in areas where monsters will get to them and destroy them. Even if you're not in a quest, even if you're not even on that map, you just get notifications that, hey, a monster is going to go destroy this camp. So you're constantly having to spend time monitoring your pop-up camps, spending your villager points to rebuild them, and the whole thing just feels more like a chore. Like, I prefer 4 or 5 permanent maps in safe areas rather than having like 4 and 8 possible locations that get destroyed every 30 minutes. It feels like a step backwards is all. I just really don't like the pop-up camps. Now, the biggest thing that I think is a step backwards is the armor skills. I feel like Capcom specifically went out of the way to force players out of the DPS skills meta, because the way armor skills work now is that we're broken up into weapon skills and armor skills. Armor skills can only be on armor, and weapon skills can only be on weapons. And when you have both your weapons, only your active weapon gives you your skills. So because of this system, it means our builds are going to be way more restricted than before, with very little room for growth. I'm not saying like all the attack skills are weapon skills and all the defensive skills are armor skills. That's definitely not the case. But no skill falls into both categories. So this limitation is going to get compounded with the fact that we can wear 2 weapons, but we still only have 1 armor set with a very niche set of skills. I personally just don't like the new armor skills. I feel like this was a terrible idea. Kind of going with that, I'm also not super interested in the dual weapon system because of this whole skill system. Like, you have to make an armor set that works for both your weapons, and really one of the only ways to do that is just run 2 of the same weapon, which you can do in the full game. You have your bow guns, 2 charge blades, sure, go for it. But at that point, why even have 2 weapons and not just let players select any weapon from the sec rate like an equipment box? It would make things a lot easier to deal with, to be honest. I just don't see why players would be using 2 of the same weapons unless they need to swap elements for a multi-monster hunt. And at that point, we're basically doing what we did before, which is go back to camp and change your gear out anyway. So I think being able to just use your sec rate like an equipment box would have been an easier option. I know I've said a lot of negative things, but there are a lot of good things I like about Wilds. And honestly, the core fighting being amazing is what keeps me playing. It just feels really good to play, except for bowguns, but I'll have another video on that specifically. But even though I love the new mechanics and all the combat inputs, there are still enough little annoyances that make me not like losing my mind crazy over this game. Like, it's a good game, but I don't really have any plans or intentions to like speedrun or get way too invested in Wilds because there's just too many of those little things that I dislike, and I would rather spend my time elsewhere these days. I like Wilds. It's a great playthrough, and of course I'm going to keep coming back to all the title updates because that's what's going to keep players invested after the first few weeks, for sure. But personally, I'm not going to get too invested in the game because my favorite weapons, the bowguns, are kind of boring. So my enthusiasm to keep playing just isn't quite there. Every other weapon feels amazing, by the way. Bow, gun lance, all the melee stuff, top notch. All in all, though, I'd say Wilds is off to a pretty good start, and 90% of the player base who's going to, play through the story, maybe make an end game set and put in 100 hours, it's great. Totally worth your time, recommend. But for those who put 3,000 hours into these games and grind all day and optimize, I don't feel like there's enough here to keep that hook in right now. But of course, as I mentioned, we have those future title updates, which we already know are announced. So I'm curious to see, kind of what the community is going to think about all the new systems, and I can't wait to watch all the new crazy speedruns, that's for sure. But anyway, that's going to be all for me. Thank you all for watching, and don't forget to check out my other Wilds videos that I'm putting together regarding mouse and keyboard setup, bowguns, and all that stuff. So peace and good luck out there, hunters.